Are behavioural addictions real? It's a complex one, obviously. The psychiatric classification systems would say some are and some aren't. So to the best of my knowledge, gambling and gaming are the only two non-chemical addictions that have made it into the psychiatric classification systems. Obviously, when we say behavioural addiction or process addiction, to give it its modern name, we're talking about addiction to things that aren't chemicals like heroin, alcohol, nicotine. So it would be things like sex, food, shopping, gambling and gaming. And of course, it's easy to see why people are so skeptical and cynical about it. Words like smartphone addiction and shopping addiction are part of common parlance now, right? But no, the psychiatric profession has formally recognized gambling and gaming as addictive disorders. Sex addiction or compulsive sexuality, compulsive sexual behavior as it's usually called in the psychiatric world, is in the classification systems, but it's placed under, I think, impulse control disorder. Similarly, food addictions, as we would call them in the recovery community, things like overeating that we would see as an addictive behavior are usually placed under eating disorders. So they're in the psychiatric world, as it were, as a treatable condition, but they're not formally seen as addictions. So that may change. You know, psychiatry it's dynamic, things change, but I'm going to explore this more from the recovery community, recovery circles perspective, more from the experiences of lay people and how they see it. So first thing to note about behavioral addictions is like chemical addictions, that it's just controversial. Everything about addiction is controversial. It gets people's heckles up. Right, and if you think about it, it smacks of moral choice. To term a compulsive sexual behavior an addiction smacks of a moral choice in a way that a true mental health condition wouldn't. An addiction is usually predominantly a behavioral health disorder, not a mental health disorder. Obviously, there are parts of addiction, usually the end stage, or there are addicts who are also suffering from a mental health condition, but we would call that a dual diagnosis. In other words, those are two distinct, discrete diagnoses. There's an addictive behavior going on and there's a mental health condition. Oftentimes end stage addiction, full on, full throttle, street using of drugs like heroin, crack cocaine, meth, occasions psychosis and other problems, brain problems that are mental health disorder. So I'm not saying that mental health disorders are not concomitant with addictions. Obviously they are, but they aren't always. And addiction itself, I would think it's more profitable to look at it as a behavioral health issue. So the difference between a behavior and a mental state, obviously, is that the behavior seems like it's under the control of a person, that the person has agency, and therefore it smacks more of moral choice than a mental state does. So for example, imagine I asked you questions like, how much do you drink? Do you smoke crack? Those are quite difficult questions to answer. Then they're impudent, but they're also difficult to answer, and it smacks of moral choice. So it sounds like I am judging you when I ask you that. Now imagine I ask you, are you in a depressed state? Are you hearing voices? Now, obviously, again, quite difficult to answer, but it doesn't sound like I'm judging you as much. It's not, people understand quite easily that there's not a lot of moral choice involved in hearing voices, but there is in smoking crack. So that's only gets worse when you start to talk about behaviors like sex and eating. How much do you eat? You eat too much. How much sex do you have? What types of sex do you have? These are questions which appear to be in the realm of morality. So it is controversial, and that's interesting for a couple of reasons. People can't view it rationally often because they're bringing, again, as is so often the case with addiction, political ideas or positions into the debate. So obviously there'd be two types of people, largely speaking, who would not want to label sexual behavior, for example, as an addiction, and those would be the people at both ends of the spectrum. Liberals or progressives, if you like, wouldn't like the word addiction attached to sex because they are sex positive, as the saying goes. They mostly are looking to normalize fetishes and things like that. And the word addiction is seen to pathologize it, so they don't like the word addiction. On the other hand, obviously, moral custodians, very conservative people, don't like the term addiction either, because it looks like if you're describing a young man who's watching 5-6 hours of porn a day and you call it an addiction, the conservatives don't like it either, because it sounds like an excuse for what is in their eyes just sinful behavior. So this doesn't help. This doesn't help at all. I'm going to bring it down and say, look, if those things were able to be addictions, then surely all we need to do is locate some kind of underlying mechanism by which it were possible, and that is similar to the same mechanism that makes chemical addictions possible. And of course there is such a thing. It's called the mesolimbic dopamine system. So all drugs of abuse, as I've covered in one of my other videos on how dopamine drives addiction, all drugs of abuse, regardless of whether they also raise other neurotransmitters like endorphins or GABA or glutamate or whatever, are activating dopamine. Anything which is interesting to you activates brain dopamine. So drugs of abuse that you've found highly enjoyable in the past most certainly activate brain dopamine. And those are the same things, that's the same neurotransmitter system that's activated when you eat simple carbohydrates like sugar or white flour products and things like that. Dopamine is strongly activated. I mean, I think they've gone overboard in the sort of media articles that you see. Sugar is as addictive as cocaine, which is obviously nonsense. What they mean is it does ride on the same neurochemical system, and that's the brain's dopamine system, the reward system. So that brain network, if you like, evolved to help us find the things that are useful for us, which of course in the ancestral environment was food and sex and shelter and things like that. So it's curious, isn't it, that behaviors centered around food and sex can be seen to be addictive. Also, the other things that tend to be addictive are usually correlated with things like money, winning, status. So workaholism, gambling, the winning of money, speculation, these types of things that are commonly, colloquially described as being addictive. Well, yes, I think there is an underlying mechanism there that would allow for that. And there's plenty of research papers that have claimed to have found a common etiology between the causation of behavioural addictions and chemical addictions. Neuroscientists like the good old classics, Ken Bloom and Mark Gold, have done a lot of research on it. Also Holden in the early 2000s. Numerous studies, I'll try to put some of the links in the description, that are claiming to find a common etiology between chemical and behavioural addictions. And that mechanism, as they all clearly explain, is the brain's mesolimbic dopamine pathway. So the way I'd explain it is this. It's almost, in a sense, an evolutionary psychology model of addiction. If you view addiction through an evolutionary psychology model instead of a developmental model, as most modern counselling psychologists do, you can easily see how behavioural addictions are a thing, right? So that's going to take a bit of explaining. First of all, the difference between evolutionary psychology and a more developmental view of human psychology, which now predominates in psychotherapy and counselling. So evolutionary psychologists would see the brain, famously, according to that discipline's founders like John Tooby, they see the brain as modular. So they used to use the analogy of domain-specific computers. I think the more modern analogy would be apps. So imagine apps on your phone. Each app does a job. That's how most evolutionary psychologists would see the brain as having developed through evolution, right? So at each point where Homo sapiens was encountering a problem, Homo sapiens and its progenitors, if you like, at each point in the primates' evolutions, you're encountering a problem like how to climb up a tree, how to find fruit trees, how to locate this, how to locate a mate, what to do when you're being predated on. Each of those ancestral environment problems created the development of a dedicated brain module, something like that, a dedicated app, if you like. And in that sense, almost like a Swiss Army knife is the other analogy they use. Problem equals the development of a brain area that solves that problem. Developmental thinkers, on the other hand, decry the relevance, really, of evolution and tend to look more at your life, real time, as it were, how your brain develops since you were born. According to the environment. They're much more nurture focused than nature focused. And the principle that they tend to lean on a lot, oftentimes inappropriately, in explaining that is the idea of brain plasticity. So the idea that the brain can change, grow new parts, adapt in real time, as it were, according to what's happening to it. So if your parents are being horrible to you, as is the common trope in psychotherapy, then your brain becomes damaged and changes, and so on and so forth. I'm obviously very cynical of that view and have broken it down in numerous other videos. Actually, there's a bit of both ideas there that's relevant to seeing how addiction, behavioural addictions could be as real as a chemical addiction. So we have the module for addiction. Obviously, we didn't evolve a dedicated addiction module, but we evolved a dedicated reward module. That's the brain's dopamine system. And indeed, it didn't evolve to help us smoke crack. It evolved to help us eat honey and copulate a lot. Food and sex was its primary reason for that app being developed, if you like, because of course those things help us survive and proliferate. Genetically. So, but the principle of neuroplasticity, of course, would say, well, a brain app or a brain network might have evolved for one reason, but quickly and easily be subsumed to do another job because it can change. And I'd say that's right. So clearly, our brain's mesolimbic dopamine system didn't evolve to help us smoke cannabis and crack cocaine. It evolved to help us eat and have sex and other things which were rewarding. We found them rewarding because they were useful. It's the dopamine that helps us find them meaningful, salient and rewarding. Right? So fast forward to the modern era, when there are a range of unnatural synthetic rewards, whether that be fentanyl or indeed pornography or junk food, they ride off the same neural system. They hitch a ride off the same neural system that initially evolved simply to make us feel rewarded when we did things that were useful for our survival. So the mechanism is there by which certainly food and sex could become addictive, and as I've explained in the other video, eventually hijack and override the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, which is evolved to help us stop doing dangerous or stupid things. Well, these dopamine agonists, like pornography and fentanyl and heroin, are obviously many times more potent than the type of fare we would have eaten in the ancestral environment. Junk food is many times more calorific than anything you really find in nature, other than perhaps honey. So it's not difficult to see how modern types of food and modern types of sex, particularly via the vector of something that is in itself compulsive, like technology, the social media platform, where you're getting likes, which in primate terms is status, e.g. a higher branch to sleep on, where your offspring do not get predated upon. It's easy to see why these things are very valuable to us, and how our modern versions of them have put them on steroids and activated mesolimbic dopamine system in a way that our prefrontal cortex can't deal with it, and you wind up getting turned out by those behaviors in much the same way that you would by drugs, right? So the mechanism's there. A simpler way of explaining that, my evolutionary psychology model of addiction, if you like, might be to take a well-known concept called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a pyramid. So most people have probably heard of that, the pyramid of human needs, where it has a range of levels of the pyramid that are prepotent to each other. So at the bottom you have food and shelter. So in other words, that's the first thing that needs to be got before you can move up to the next level of the pyramid. And I always jokingly say, actually, there's a level that comes before food and shelter, and that's oxygen. Obviously, if somebody's choking you out, you don't care about the fact that you're hungry or even starving to death. You're going to get their arm off your neck before you proceed to go and find some food. But you get the idea. There are certain human needs that must occur, and these are primate needs. They're not just human needs. Most of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are primate needs, which is pertinent to what I'm saying. So you've got oxygen, and then next up level of the pyramid is food and water, and then next up is shelter, and then next up is sex and procreation, and then next up is perhaps becoming now slightly more human, although not uniquely human, is love and belonging and nurturing, and then the esteem of others. Perhaps that's uniquely human, perhaps not. I suppose primatologists would probably tell me I'm wrong there, that chimps do love the esteem of others. Pecking order, things like that, which of course have survival ramifications. Right at the tip top of Maslow's pyramid of needs, though, is a very uniquely human thing, which is meaning or self-actualization. So the point being that you won't be bothered about self-actualizing if you're starving. People in developing countries don't go into existential crises about whether their career is meaningful to them, because they're too busy fighting to survive. Now, the interesting thing to do with this evolutionary psychology model of addiction is to plot the different addictions onto that pyramid, including behavioural addictions, so-called alleged behavioural addictions, food, overeating, sex, likes on social media, and of course drugs. Plot them onto that and see if they fit. See if they fulfill those primate or human needs. And they do, obviously, because it's food and sex and love. Love, famously, there are 12-step fellowships like Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous that are not even focused on mechanical sex. So if you have a 12-step fellowship, there are 3 S fellowships, as we call them, sex addiction fellowships, and they all have a slightly different tone. Sex Addicts Anonymous and Sexaholics Anonymous. Sexaholics Anonymous in particular, I would say, is predominantly men. It's predominantly men that would be engaged in mechanical sexual behaviours like visiting sex workers. Sex Addicts Anonymous, I always call it the middle ground of includes porn addicts, people that use sex workers, but also compulsive romancers. And then Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, which is kind of the left wing of the S fellowships, if you like, is predominantly, it certainly has a lot more women in it, and it's predominantly focused on romantic behaviours that are dysfunctional. So the idea that love itself can be addictive is definitely a thing, and it tends to be a slightly more female-orientated sexual romantic obsession. Am I capturing the interest of the other person? Is the other person still interested in me? Chasing people, getting validation. So that fits with the sort of nurturing aspect of Maslow's pyramid of needs. Gambling and speculation and workaholism would fit with the acquisition of status and resources, the acquisition of resources, which is a fundamental human need. The only one that doesn't fit on there is drugs. Actual, synthetic, fake, unnatural, modern drugs, which of course didn't exist in the ancestral environment, but I would posit the idea that they are a resource. So in evolutionary terms, they increase fitness. So if somebody is struggling, doesn't matter whether they're from ghetto, project, in a city area, that type of struggling, struggling to survive, or whether they're struggling emotionally, even within a fairly well-off family, they need energy. They need a suit of armor. Famously, if you talk to a lot of addicted people, especially people in recovery, they will tell you that their drug of choice, especially things like opioids, are to some extent a sort of suit of armor. And the word heroin wasn't so called for no reason. Initially it was shown to increase emotional toughness or feeling of invincibility. I mean, when you first start using heroin, oftentimes you won't necessarily go on the nod or feel terrible afterwards. Oftentimes, if you're using opioids intermittently at the beginning of your addiction, and there are days off in between, you feel fantastically healthy on those days, right? It's one of the dangers, really, that sucks you in. So heroin isn't called what it's called for no reason. And so I would say that drugs, chemicals that increase your energy, focus, emotional durability are a resource that are useful for your survival. At least they are subjectively perceived to be useful for your survival. And that's the final interesting point, I think, which is if you look at addiction from an evolutionary psychology angle, how our brains evolved and how the mesolimbic dopamine system has gotten hijacked by modern unnatural rewards. The brain doesn't care that you're looking at Facebook. It doesn't know, in a sense, that you're looking at Facebook. It just sees a status competition. It just sees that dopamine feedback loop that's been famously described by dissident Facebook engineers as deliberately having been designed to hack into our brain's dopamine system. That is exactly how it works. It doesn't matter whether you get a lot of likes or don't get a lot of likes, you're going back for more. And what you're going back for is status, validation, which is useful on Maslow's pyramid of needs. It's a fundamental primate need to sit higher up in the pack if possible, because you survive better, increases your fitness in evolutionary terms. So another example, the brain doesn't see pornography, it just sees the proliferation of your genes. It just sees or feels sex, and sex means proliferation of you. And so the brain doesn't care if it's porn or real sex, presumably, right? And so that is how these behaviors that weren't initially designed to activate your brain's reward functions do so, right? So the underlying mechanism is there for, especially for simple carbohydrates to become addictive, especially for steroidal forms of sex like pornography to become addictive, for the easy consumption of massive amounts of resources via just being able to have them delivered to your house and things like that. You can see that the vectors, if you like, the deliverers of rewards have increased via technology. So a vector, like if you imagine a mosquito is a vector of malaria, right? So addiction has vectors as well. Social media is one of them. Computers are the vector of pornography and therefore compulsive sexual behavior, right? So I think the answer is yes, behavioral addictions are real. Is discussion around them hyperbolic and stupid a lot of the time? Yes, of course. What's that witty refrain? Help, I'm addicted to air. Yeah, obviously it's easy to see why people are cynical and think it's ridiculous, because it's been abused, like so many concepts to do with addiction. It's a case of concept creep. But the initial idea that behaviors can be as addictive as chemicals depends what the behavior is, but all you're looking for is a reward. Is it salient, meaningful and rewarding to a human? And if it is, there's a brain mechanism that can get hijacked.